Welcome to HQ Spotlight here on CBS Sports Network. I'm Jordan Giorgio. With the end of the NFL regular season near, yesterday we saw a ton of teams eliminated from playoff contention, and arguably most notable and most shocking for most was the Kansas City Chiefs. The Chiefs suffered a 16-13 loss to the Los Angeles Chargers in front of their home crowd at Arrowhead Stadium to fall to 6-8 this season. And to make matters even worse, they lost their quarterback, Patrick Mahomes, to a torn ACL injury. It marks the first time since 2014 the Chiefs have not made the playoffs, ending this team's incredible run of 3 straight trips to the Super Bowl. Now, the Chiefs weren't the only team from the AFC that's going to be booking their offseason vacations early, if you will, as you take a look at all of the AFC teams eliminated from the playoffs. For much more on those eliminated in the AFC, let's go ahead and say hello to our own resident GM, Rand Carthon. We have Ryan Wilson also joining us from afar. So you're going to be giving us really the overall analysis from the GM perspective on these teams, how to fix all of the issues that they're dealing with right now. And then, of course, Ryan Wilson, our draft analyst, will tell us the biggest needs for each team when it comes to the NFL draft. Let's start with those Kansas City Chiefs right now. What is top priority?
Well, I mean, immediately everyone's going to automatically assume who's going to be the next quarterback, which I agree, but we know that that's more of a short-term view of it. For me, is how are we going to rework this entire roster? Because Patrick Mahomes suffered the ACL. We talked about that. But Travis Kelce, I don't expect him to be back with the team next year. And so after that, you have to rework some of the guys on defense, and you have to figure out what iteration of this offensive line are you going to have moving forward. So to me, it's how are we going to rework this roster as a whole, because that was going to be the question coming into next year anyway, pre-Patrick Mahomes injury. But now for a guy like Andy Reid, I know there are some concerns about, is he going to want to deal with this at his age? I think this is what's going to really excite and motivate Andy Reid going into this offseason.
Yeah, Andy Reid's 67 years old, so that is a fair question. The other question about age, Rand and Jordan, Patrick Mahomes is 30, and he'll come back from the ACL, and ACL recovery surgeries are certainly much farther along than they were 30, 40 years ago. But to Rand's initial point, I think the offensive line is going to be a huge need. They drafted Josh Simmons last year to left tackle. He's battled injuries, so he is not playing right now. But they could very easily draft a right tackle in the first round, where they pick currently at 11th, I believe. And one name that I sort of like, Rand, is Francis Malinois, the right tackle out of Miami. Rand has talked about perhaps kicking him inside. Whatever the case, you probably need to replace Jawan Taylor, because he currently leads the league in penalties. So that is not going to be sustainable. The other thing we've talked about, defensive line is going to be an issue. And maybe someone like Caden McDonald, who I know Rand likes a lot, could be available early in the second round as a stopgap replacement for Chris Jones at some level. Running back, wide receiver, even some members of the secondary are going to be up for grabs. In Kansas City, a team, Jordan, as you pointed out, at 6-8, suddenly have a ton of needs, which is a wild thing to say about a team that feels like every single season's in the Super Bowl.
Exactly, but it truly feels like an end of an era. Let's look elsewhere, you guys, and zero in on the Bengals, eliminated from the playoffs for a third consecutive year. Something tells me a lot of fans will maybe point towards Joe Burrow's early injury as maybe an excuse. However, I think there were a ton of missed opportunities with this team. What's top priority for Cincy?
No, for me, it's you got to address the defense. When you have spent the amount of money they have spent on their 2 receivers and their quarterback, it typically leads you from a team-building standpoint to have to spend your draft resources on the other side of the football. And so for me, it's finding those key players on the defense. Now, again, you're picking in the top 10, so what defensive player fits that high-level, high-caliber player? But with a new defensive coordinator in Al Golden, he's going to want his type of guys that can come in and make not only an impact on the field, but off the field and in the locker room. So who are those culture-changing players that will be available to you? I know Ryan has some guys, 2 guys that jump out to me. Caleb Downs from Ohio State University, and we talk about that's the secondary part of it, but then addressing the defense up front and adding a guy in the interior defensive line like Peter Woods out of Clemson.
Yeah, that would be best case scenario for a Bengals team. As you know, Rand, they've spent so much money on offense. You got to fix the defense at some point. They've tried in the draft. It just hasn't worked. They're going to need edge rush help as well. You mentioned interior defensive line. If you're building a defense, and you and I talked about this, you want to start up front and in the middle. and they can virtually take anyone and be better. They drafted Demetrius Knight at linebacker, but they could use some off-ball linebacker help with Sonny Styles out of Ohio State. Makes sense. The other guy that plays alongside Arvell Reese, and they're going to have tons of needs in the secondary. What they don't need are wide receivers and a quarterback, but just about everything else, Jordan, feels like it's on the table.
Yeah, most definitely. Some options there, that's for sure. One team's season that has been over for quite some time, a few weeks now, the Las Vegas Raiders. What has to change, you guys, and does it start at the top with Pete Carroll?
I think you have to figure out if Pete Carroll is the guy moving forward. I am a believer in Pete Carroll. I've seen it. I've lived it in terms of being in the NFC West with the Rams and with the 49ers and having to go against Pete Carroll teams. I'm not one to give guys one and done. I think you have to allow his way to kind of come into fruition and them get their type of guys. But again, I think you have to address the question of, at Pete Carroll's age, and with the type of season we have, is Pete Carroll our head coach?
But I think, too, on the flip side of that, does he even want to stay? That might be a little shocking. And I fear, though, really the problem goes much farther than just the coaching, right?
Yeah, but you got to understand, these guys are lifers. The Pete Carrolls, the Andy Reids, these are conversations that I'm pretty sure they had. Pete Carroll doesn't sign the contract he did with the understanding of, I may not want to do this after a year. Pete Carroll loves coaching ball. He loves being around ball. So I wouldn't imagine him wanting to do anything else.
Ryan, what do you think?
Yeah, and Pete Carroll's 7 years older than Andy Reid. But to Rand's larger point, there's a certain type that gets into coaching and stays into coaching until age 74. And certainly Pete Carroll acts like he's 20 years younger. But this season has put some years on his life, no doubt about it. And the frustration you see on the sidelines was seldom seen during his time in Seattle and USC before that. Now, in terms of what they need, again, when we're talking about some of these teams that are so bad this year, Jordan, just throw a dart at the dartboard, hit a position, and you're going to be probably more right than wrong. Geno Smith has struggled. Kenny Pickett has struggled in relief. Quarterback's going to have to be at the top of the to-do list. They currently pick number 2 overall. Is there a QB2 they like that high? We'll find out as we get through this process. The offensive line's been banged up and truly and utterly terrible with the backups in there, so you have to have a plan for either replacing the starters or having a plan if the starters do in fact get hurt. The defense has 1.5 players, and his name is Max Crosby. You have to short things up there. So if there's not a quarterback you like it too, trade down if at all possible. Stockpile as many picks as possible because this team is not one player away. They have needs on both sides of the ball. I didn't even mention receiver. They traded away Jacoby Myers. They drafted a few guys this time around that haven't quite yet worked out. So that could also be another need.
I mean, at his age, a lot of work to be done. But I guess if you love the game, I understand it. I get it. The Raiders, obviously, out of playoff contention at 2-12 that you see at the bottom of your screen. A long list of teams also eliminated. That also includes the Tennessee Titans now, Ryan. Let's get to them because right now they sit among the top of the draft board. Currently, what is their biggest need?
It ain't quarterback, and I give Cam Ward a ton of credit for the way that he has played this year under some pretty dire circumstances. They drafted a couple of wide receivers and Elikai Minor early on day 3 and then Tamir DK a little while later. Those guys have stood out. You know who else has stood out is tight end Gunnar Helm. They could still use an explosive wide receiver, and that could be in the cards as well. If they're picking top 5, and it looks like they are, Arvell Reese is going to be a very popular name out of Ohio State. He can play off-ball linebacker. He can play the edge rush position, and you can never have enough defensive linemen to go along Jeffrey Simmons. So offensive line would also be a consideration. They signed Moore last year from the Pittsburgh Steelers. He plays left tackle. You could sign another or draft another tackle and decide what you want to do with J.C. Latham on the right or left side. So, again, any number of directions you can go to make this team better. They're going to need about 4 or 5 guys. And, oh, by the way, Jordan, they have to get their head coach situation sorted out as well after moving on from Brian Callahan about a month ago. So, quarterback situation settled. A lot of other questions after that.
Before we move on to our last and final team, how much of an impact could maybe next week's game against the Chiefs have when it comes to their draft positioning, considering that Mahomes is now out and their chances at a win maybe more likely?
Yeah, and that's going to be interesting, right? Because back in 2017, They traded up to number 10 to get, what was his name, Patrick Mahomes. Yeah. So if you get that pick right, inside the top 12, inside the top 10, that can certainly make things incredibly easy for you going forward. Now, it's hard to do, and certainly quarterback isn't a need for the Kansas City Chiefs. But if they get an offensive tackle who can solidify one side opposite Josh Simmons, that's huge. If they can get someone like Peter Woods, who we heard Rand talk about, to solidify the middle of that defense in a post-Chris Jones world, that is huge. We saw them a few years ago with that draft class against George Karlaftis, Trent McDuffie, Jalen Warren, and Isaiah Pacheco in the 7th round, Jalen Watson, excuse me. And if you can crush a draft class from top to bottom, it's a lot easier to be competitive even on a Chiefs team that is somehow 6-8 as we sit here, Jordan.
Let's keep it rolling here to our next team, the Browns, also a team among the top of the draft board currently. No secret that they'll be looking for some offensive help, but what else do they need in that building, Rand?
Well, I think the number one question is who's going to be our quarterback? Yeah. And is that quarterback on our current roster, or are we moving around the draft board to put ourselves in position to take that quarterback? And so to me, that is the number one question they're going to have to answer. And again, once you figure out who the quarterback is, then now you can address who's going to protect him, who we're going to put in front of him, which guys are we going to surround him with in terms of playmakers to help, bring that quarterback's ability to the forefront. But it all starts with who is our quarterback.
Yeah, and that's a question that probably won't be answered for some time now, and it's going to be interesting, guys, because they have those 2 first-round picks, and we'll see how that sorts itself out. But other needs that are front and center, offensive line, they have a ton of guys who are injured and a ton of guys whose contracts are going to be up after the end of the year. You got to fix the offensive line. Wide receiver is perhaps the biggest need of this team, maybe none bigger on any other team than wide receiver. Jerry Jeudy scored a touchdown on some route he made up. It looked like a dig, it looked like a post. Either way, he took it to the house 2 weeks ago in that Titans game, and that was great. But he can't be your wide receiver 1. Harold Fannin Jr., the rookie tight end, has been fantastic. David Njoku's in last year of his deal as well. And Rand, we did this in our mock draft last week. You can never have enough defensive players either. If you have Peter Woods staring you in the face, you take him there as defensive line and line him up next to Mason Graham and Myles Garrett and worry about your next pick, because that defense is going to be even better than it currently is.
The Browns' needs right now looking very identical to the New York Jets, and that's where we'll end here. Let's touch on those Jets whose playoff drought now reaches 15 years. What do you want to see done by this franchise this offseason?
Same question. Who's our quarterback? Got to figure out that quarterback position. I think that's the position that's hampered them the most. Under Robert Saleh, when he was the head coach, their defense played well, and they played well, and they were opportunistic, and they flew around and played with their hair on fire, but they could never muster enough points to outscore the opposing offense. And so a lot of that started with the quarterback. And so for them, they've tried to address it numerous times, and just hadn't been able to find that one guy. Can they do that now? We don't know. We'll see. But the number one question for this New York Jets franchise is, who is our quarterback?
Quarterback for sure. Wide receiver, they did trade for A.D. Mitchell as part of the Sauce Gardner deal. He'll pair with Garrett Wilson, but that's going to be a need as well, wide receiver. And then the guys you gave up, Sauce Gardner cornerback, Quinnen Williams defensive line, and some help in the secondary. So again, when you're a 2 or 3 win team, there are very few things you don't need, and the Jets certainly fall into that category.
All right, we will end there. The 3-11 Jets not going to be in the playoff picture. Let's show you a look, though, at how things stand currently when it comes to the AFC playoff picture. 12-2 Broncos leading their division along with the Patriots. Still, after suffering a loss to the Bills, you see still in the hunt in that wild card category. Much more from us when we return. We went through the AFC, so naturally you knew this was coming. We're tackling the NFC teams eliminated from playoff contention and how to fix them next on HQ Spotlight. Stay with us.